Good afternoon, friends, and thank you very much for coming here towards the end of the week. We have, as you are aware, this is a briefing about the forthcoming G20 summit in St. Petersburg. We have here with us Deputy Chairperson Mr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia, who is the Sherpa of the Prime Minister for this meeting. Along with him are Mr. Dinesh Bhatia, Joint Secretary from the Ministry of External Affairs, who is the Su Sherpa, and further to his right is Ms. Usha Titus, Joint Secretary from the Ministry of Finance. She also is the Su Sherpa. What we will do is I'll request the Deputy Chairperson to make a few opening remarks, following which we will open the floor for questions relating to the G20, and I'm certain that you would also like questions on other issues. So after the closure of the questions on the G20, the Deputy Chairperson has agreed to respond to a few questions on other matters. With that introductory remarks, I'll ask the Deputy Chairperson to make his opening remarks. Thank you.
Thanks very much, and thank you all for coming. You know, there's not much to be said in the opening remarks other than to say that we're heading out to a very important summit meeting at St. Petersburg, which, as you know, the G20 was constituted to be the premier international forum for discussing international economic issues. And that's going to be the agenda. There are lots of international economic issues that are concerning many people. So we're looking forward to a really good meeting. It's going to be a two-day meeting. The heads of government will come. Out of that, based on various discussions, some of which have actually started, and they will now intensify in the next 2 days when the Sherpas and the finance deputies meet. We hope that at the end of it we will have a sort of St. Petersburg action plan which will sort of indicate how do the G20 see the top priorities for the coming year. Now, since I'm about to head out there tomorrow, I can't anticipate what will happen in these meetings, but I'd be very happy to give you our perspective on whatever questions that you have. So how are you conducting the meeting? Okay, so questions.
Okay, the floor is open. Yes, Siddharth.
Thank you, Mr. Ahluwalia. The question and this is specifically related only to the G20, is that there has been a build-up of expectations in a lot of commentary over the past 4 to 5 weeks that one, India is considering approaching multilateral institutions for support to counter the ongoing economic issues that it faces. And then 2 days back, in fact yesterday, there have been reports quoting finance ministry officials, advisors, that as far as currency is concerned, this is going to be a specific issue that will come up, a currency swap arrangement, which in fact, there was something that we had already operationalized a year back and have not utilized from countries like Japan. Could you offer us details on whether you are going to take up and approach the issue of currency stabilization in any manner whatsoever at the G20 deliberations? And from your point of view, from the country's point of view, what are the other points that you would like to bring on the agenda there?
Okay. Well, I mean, you asked, I suppose, questions on the same subject, but triangulating from different ways. So let me respond. At one stage, you seem to be asking whether we're using this summit to approach the multilateral institutions. Presumably, you had in mind approaching them for some sort of financial assistance. Categorically, no. That is not on the agenda. And my personal view, by the way, is that we don't need it either. If we ever needed it, of course, we've done it before and we can do it again. But I can assure you that as far as I'm concerned, this is not at all on the agenda. This will not be discussed. Now, it's a different issue that the role of multilateral institutions vis-a-vis emerging market countries, that, of course, will be discussed. But it's not an India-specific issue and certainly not connected with any of the currency volatility that you've seen. Then you talked about finance. I don't know what the finance ministry officials should speak for themselves. But as far as currency swap arrangements are concerned, you mentioned the one we have with Japan, that it's there. That's not something that we would be discussing in the summit, for sure. You also mentioned something on which a decision had been taken, and I think you have in mind the possibility of a currency swap among the BRICS, and that has been discussed. Again, it won't be on the agenda of the summit, but it's quite possible that the BRICS leaders, when they usually meet on the sidelines of the summit, so they might give an indication of what the latest position is. I mean, we've been in favor of entering into some kind of a swap arrangement, but that again is not really the G20 summit. That's simply updating you. I think, if I'm not wrong, I think in Durban last year, they sort of agreed on a swap adding up to $100 billion. And then they've been working on what would be the different components, etc. Maybe you get an update, but that's not... I don't have any role vis-a-vis the BRICS, because I'm not the Sherpa for the BRICS summit. So that's the position, really. Now, on the larger issue, I do think that currency volatility is going to be, and should be, a very important part of the summit-level discussions. Because, newspapers all over the world have been focusing on the fact that the anticipated sort of withdrawal of QE3, of quantitative easing, will lead to a change in flows, and already markets have anticipated that, and yields in the US have gone up, and money has moved out from other markets into the United States, and that has led to a lot of currency volatility. We've also been affected by that. So I think the issue of, obviously countries have to have their own monetary policy, guided by whatever their national domestic objectives are. I mean, that's what we do, that's what America does, that's what the European Central Bank does. But the purpose of the G20 is that different policies, which are ultimately guided invariably by national interests, should be so calibrated to keep in mind the impact on other countries. Because actually that is also in the national interest. I mean, it's not in anybody's interest to do something assuming that the domestic positive effects are good, and if there are negative global effects, that they won't impact on them. So I'm sure, I mean, certainly my view, and I have no idea exactly how the discussion will go, but I think my view is that the G20 mutual assessment process, which was designed to be able to talk to each other and to get a sense of, what are you going to do, what am I going to do, what's going to be the combined effect, etc. I think this should include consideration of deployment of monetary policy instruments for the reserve currency countries. In principle, the same thing would be true in all other countries also. But the spillover effects of a non-reserve currency monetary policy are very small. And that certainly we will raise this issue. I have no idea how people will react to it. But that is an important part of, of the plurilateral effort to coordinate policy amongst these major countries.
Mr. Venkat Narayan.
Dr. Ahluwalia, the G4 leaders are also will be there. Are you expecting a possible meeting of the G4 on the sidelines of the G20? And
G4? Who's G4?
I mean, the group of 4 countries aspiring for Security Council membership.
Yeah, that's his. Yeah, okay.
Germany, Japan, Brazil.
G4, okay.
Yeah, that G4. Yeah.
Is that a conventional terminology now?
Yes. To handle political issues.
Yeah. Is there actually a meeting of the G4 leaders, and the possibility of the expansion of the Security Council? Does it ever figure in the G20 meetings? And is it likely to be taken up at this meeting?
No, that's a good point. It tells you that, since I didn't even recognize the phrase G4, this is not in my area. This is the principal forum for international economic interaction. So the whole UN structure that you can call economic, which is, the Bretton Woods institutions, WTO, others, etc., they're included. To my knowledge, in the past, we've not focused on Security Council reform or even broadly UN reform. That's a very important area, but I don't think it's ever been covered in the G20, and therefore I assume that it won't be on the formal agenda.
Pawan?
That's okay?
डॉक्टर अहलूवालिया, मैं पवन हूं जी बिजनेस से। अजीम प्रेम जी ने चिट्ठी लिखी पिछले हफ्ते प्राइम मिनिस्टर को, ये कहा कि जो इमिग्रेशन बिल है यूएसए में वो बहुत बड़ी समस्या है यहाँ की इंडस्ट्री के लिए, खासकर जो आईटी इंडस्ट्री है उनके लिए। ठीक उसी तरह से जो यूके में हुआ है, वीजा के लिए जो उन्होंने फीस ज्यादा एक अमाउंट है 2.5 लाख का, वो देना पड़ेगा सबको। जब प्रोटेक्शनिज्म की बात करते हैं G20 पे, हर साल इस बात पे डिस्कस होता है। क्या ये दोनों इश्यूज इस बार भारत सरकार की तरफ से उठाया जाएगा?
देखिए, एक तो ये बायलैटरल इशू है इंडिया और यूएस का, और मैं पक्का कह सकता हूं कि जब इंडिया यूएस डिस्कशंस होती हैं तो ये इशू जरूर उठाया जाएगा। लेकिन ये G20 के लिए इशू नहीं है। G20 के लिए ये इशू हो सकता था अगर इमिग्रेशन के बारे में कोई इंटरनेशनल एग्रीमेंट होती, लेकिन वो इंटरनेशनल एग्रीमेंट है नहीं। तो जो WTO एग्रीमेंट्स हैं रियली ऑन गुड्स एट द मोमेंट, उसमें इमिग्रेशन नॉट कवर्ड, so it's not an international issue. You can do whatever you want on immigration without violating any international agreement. That doesn't mean you should do it, and we certainly argue with them bilaterally. ये जो मुद्दा आपने उठाया बहुत इम्पोर्टेंट है, क्योंकि हमारा केस ये नहीं है कि ये जो रिस्ट्रिक्शंस अभी तक उन्होंने लागू नहीं किए, लेकिन उनकी लेजिस्लेटिव प्रोसेस में चल रहा है ये, कि ये हिंदुस्तान को हर्ट करेंगी। हमारी व्यू ये है कि यूएस इंडस्ट्री की भी कम्पिटिटिवनेस को अफेक्ट करेंगी, लेकिन ये बायलैटरल इशू है। Maybe it will come up in September when the PM goes there. Yeah.
Madhavan from Hindustan Times. Dr. Ahluwalia, I just would want you to elaborate a bit on the currency swap as a concept, because is it in any way, because it's very sketchy right now, I agree, but at least at a conceptual level we could have some clarity. You have $100 billion tied up in Durban. What does it mean? Maybe Ms. Titus can answer that.
No,
and
that's
also, it is also the larger question is, does it in any way resemble the old rupee trade or anything that we used to have with Russia?
Good point. No, very good point. See, since this particular arrangement is not yet in place, I will give you a reaction based on what currency swaps normally are, and I'm sure that whenever they get the details, it'll be something similar. Point number one is, this is not rupee trade. This is not bilateral settlement of trade in any way in local rupees. This is a straightforward, if you like, a cooperation in providing liquidity. And most currency swaps operate in the following manner. That's what Chiang Mai does, that basically different countries agree to make a certain amount of money available, okay? When they make a certain amount of money available, then each country can draw on that pool. And if a country needs to draw, then the other countries, in effect, make the money available in the proportion that they have committed to the pool. So it's not as if you take the money and put it into another organization. It's there on call, okay? And you make the money available. And usually there are some rules. And those rules usually are that, let's say, hypothetically, if you enter into a swap where you're contributing something, 10 billion or 20 billion or something like that. So if you're contributing, say, $10 billion, then what it will usually mean is a certain amount you can draw, just for the asking. So if you want $3-4 billion or something like that, everybody else has to dish it out, and you repay it at a certain time.
It's akin to the special drawing rights in some way.
No, that depends on how you denominate the swap.
Okay.
Because this is nothing to do with the IMF. This is a cooperative arrangement between 3 or 4 central banks. So if there are 4 central banks and one of them decides to draw money, the other 3 fellows will dip into their reserves and give them the money like a kind of a loan.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Just one small point to add.
But I just want to add one more thing, and that is that at least I think in Chiang Mai, when you go beyond a certain level, the countries concerned actually say that, look, if you want more money, then it has to be linked to an IMF arrangement. So that is interesting, because you see, if you are forced to go to the IMF, then it's not a completely free swap. But on the other hand, the argument is that you'll be going to the IMF for less than you otherwise would, and that strengthens your bargaining power with that institution. None of these things is relevant for us at present, in my view, because I don't think our reserves position is such that we would need. However, it's become a bit of a fashion globally now to have currency swaps. I mean, if you read some of the documents that the IMF produces, the latest assessments are that there are 3 levels of safety nets. Level number 1 of safety nets is your own reserves. Level number 2 of safety nets is some kind of regional currency arrangement, which is a little more informal and depends on whatever your own relationship is. And level number 3 is going to the IMF, which is much more formal and usually involves conditionality. So that's the position. I have no idea what's going to happen. My information is that 100 billion is agreed. We now have to operationalize it. This is not a G20 issue. This is a BRICS issue.
Dr. Anshuman Suman.
Akhilesh.
Sorry.
Sir, Prime Minister yesterday, during his clarification in Rajya Sabha, said that he has certain influence over the finance minister and head of states in G20. So it will be interesting to know that what issues are you going to raise in G20 meeting, and are you going to suggest any more that why India can regain its old status in economy? And are you going to take any help from IMF at this point of time?
You mean take the help of the IMF to make suggestions to the G20, or you're saying go to the IMF? No, I've already said I'm not aware of any plan to approach the IMF. I don't think our current economic situation requires it. And, my view on these matters is that if your situation requires it, we are members of the IMF, so we should go. But we don't need to go. And I don't anticipate that in the near future at all. Now the question you asked is, what is the PM going to say? I don't want to anticipate that, because after all, if you're going with him on the flight, you can always ask him, and he'll be better informed by then. But broadly, I would expect that, as always, he would be a very important, to my mind, knowledgeable voice, reflecting not just India's concerns, but actually the concerns of the major emerging markets and also the developing world as a whole. It's a very big agenda. The agenda includes the global economy, it includes development issues, it includes financial sector reform post the financial crisis, it includes the international financial architecture, reform, the World Bank, IMF reform, those kinds of things. It includes trade, it includes energy, and a whole slew of other issues. So I think on all of these issues, and he'll be talking to his colleagues, we will be briefing him on what are the other countries saying. So basically it will be India's view on these issues that he will be putting forward, and we would hope that, he will be able to persuade his colleagues to a similar point of view, and the extent to which he's able to do that will be reflected in whatever the declaration is that comes out.
Manish?
There's going to be an important meeting of BRICS leaders on the sidelines of the G20 summit. What broadly is going to be an agenda? It's been 5 months since the Durban summit. What's the progress in the development bank, for example? Also, is the BRICS grouping is going to work as a grouping within the G20 process to advance common position and interest?
Well, as I've already clarified, but I'm not the Sherpa for the BRICS meeting, so I'm not informed. But, on both these issues, BRICS Bank and so on, I think the actual hard work on that is done in the BRICS finance ministers meeting, and when they're ready, the summit more or less endorses it. Remember, this is not a BRICS summit. This is a BRICS meeting on the sideline of the G20. So generally, I would have thought major announcements of a BRICS new initiative would come in the BRICS summit. When is the BRICS summit?
BRICS summit will be next year, also in Brazil.
Brazil. So the next summit there is going to be in Brazil, and that's when all the BRICS preparatory work takes place. They have in the past traditionally met on the sidelines of the G20, partly to simply coordinate their views or hear each other. You know, that's one of the things that makes a lot of sense. And sometimes they've used the occasion to update people on ongoing BRICS activity. The two ongoing items are the currency arrangement and also the BRICS Bank. But whether they will be in a position to make an announcement on those, I honestly don't know. I doubt if you will get any announcements on the BRICS Bank, because I don't think that work is that. So they'll be reviewing progress in these areas.
Yeah, Mr. Ahluwalia, you talked initially about the St. Petersburg action plan. And I just want to know a broad outline of the component of the action plan which is likely to emerge of cooperation among the G20.
Well, to some extent, that's when we get there, that's when it's drafted. So normally what has happened is the action plan sort of reflects what is the agreed position of leaders, but it puts it down with a little bit more detail. And it builds into it what the G20 finance ministers have also agreed. So this will be one of the things that we will be looking at in terms of drafting sessions. Therefore, it's not yet a final product anyway. I think broadly it will cover the issues I've talked about, but most importantly, it will signal what do the leaders say on these issues. So in a way, it's impossible at this point to say that would be what it would be, unless you resort to astrology or something. So, you know, I mean, to be fair, there are lots of drafts that float around, but typically at any given time, there are drafts, then hundreds of countries, well, hundreds of comments from different countries. So there isn't a document which is an agreed document yet, you know.
So yesterday the Prime Minister, you know, in both the Houses of Parliament raised the issue about subsidies. I mean, and as you see the monetary policy having effect on the dollar vis-a-vis the oil subsidy. Do you believe that this is something that does not really benefit the poor? And does this mean that, you know, we should be ready for, you know, cutting the oil subsidy bill because it's now going to nearly 1,80,000 crores?
I take it we've moved away from the G20 to domestic matters. I mean, let me put it this way. Let's finish with the G20. Incidentally, the issue of energy subsidies is one of the issues that comes up in the G20. The G20 on many summits have said that we must cut down fossil fuel subsidies, except those that are targeted to the poor. The Indian policy documents, the 11th plan, 12th plan, the integrated energy, all of them say the same thing. So we don't have any real difference with the rest of the world on the merits of this broad approach. I don't think they're asking us to make any commitments or anything. The only commitments that are being made in the G20 are we going to maintain a reasonable fiscal deficit or not? And I think we have indicated to them, the finance minister has indicated this, the prime minister has indicated this, that the fiscal deficit is going to be at 4.8% of GDP. Now, on energy subsidies more generally, look, our policy has been to phase out energy subsidies except those that are targeted. And I think that's a correct policy. So I hope that will actually be implemented over time.
Srutiji?
Saron, could you run us through could you run us through the key issues in terms of trade and tariff barriers, etc. And also on Syria, it's bound to come up at the G20. Do we have, if it does come up, what is going to be our position, or will we make a statement of any sort?
Well, as you can imagine, since this is a very recent development, no earlier meeting has actually discussed Syria. And besides, it's not part of the normal economic agenda. It's obviously a very important issue. So I can't judge what would be the position in that regard and to what extent the leaders would want to take note of it at all. So it's not, I mean, on Syria, I have really no comment to make at all at this point.
Yes.
Trade. Oh, I'm sorry, trade. What was the question on trade? What are the issues? Good point. Actually, the general approach, I'm sorry, I zeroed in on obviously what is the most, what everyone's speculating on. No, on trade, I can tell you what our position has been. First of all, and I think most countries agree with this, that multilateral trade liberalization is an extremely important part of any sensible global policy for stimulating growth and production and efficiency and so on. We have been engaged in the Doha round. It used to be called the Doha Development Round, and we've been engaged in it for a long time, not been able to make progress. Most countries would want to assert that we should bring the Doha Development Round to a successful conclusion, and certainly that would be our position, and I would hope that the summit also endorses that. More practically, there is going to be a ministerial meeting in Bali on the 9th of November, I think. It's the 9th ministerial? Yeah, in Bali. And that has certain items on it. One of them, there are several, but trade facilitation is one of them. Something on agriculture, which responds to the developing countries' concerns, is another. Global value chains was a third. And I think that most people would like to see a successful outcome in Bali. As far as we are concerned, that's also our view. But we don't view Bali as a separate thing. I mean, really it should be a stepping stone to achieving a successful outcome of the Doha round. And I think India and many other developing countries are concerned that, the central focus on making progress in the Doha round should not be lost sight of. Meanwhile, in the past, we have voluntarily, all of us, undertaken some kind of a pledge not to resort to protectionist measures. And the truth is that the WTO gives us a report. To what extent has this been maintained? They look at every single measure that a country has taken, including liberalization measures, and then they try to look at the net effect. Now, I think their assessment has been that in past several occasions, it's not the case that no protectionist measure has been taken. The measures that have been taken are small. Many of them are offset by measures to liberalize. And the general assessment is that this declaration has certainly contained what many would have feared to be an excessive resort to protectionism. Although if you view it on the sort of whitest of white kind of criteria, almost every country has undertaken some measure which can be called a little bit protectionist. I think this issue will come up again, and I know that many countries want that since we haven't concluded the Doha round, the last promise we made was that we undertake not to have any protectionist measures until the end of December 2014, which is next year. Most people feel that there isn't enough time to conclude the Doha round between now and then. So there is a move that perhaps the leaders should give a commitment to extend this pledge. There are different views on this. So one of the interesting things that would come out of the summit is what happens to this move. Do the leaders agree to extend the pledge or not? And I think that's a substantive issue.
Good afternoon, Alexander from TASS News Agency of Russia. Russia offered to organize the G20 agenda based on three priority areas, three priorities issues and 8 areas. Which among them India feel the special for itself? Thank you very much.
Well, I think most countries, certainly India, generally have agreed with the broad priorities that the Russian presidency has brought to the St. Petersburg summit. There's none of those areas are areas that we don't think are important. I don't want to say now which one is important and which one is less important. I think they're all important. And I would hope that we would see progress in each of them. Okay?
कुमार राकेश इधर आपने करेंसी के बारे में कई सारी बातें की और बताया आपने G20 के बारे में भी मेरा एक छोटा सा सवाल ये है कि जो रुपए की हालात हैं जो हालत हुई है रुपये की ऐतिहासिक है नंबर 1 आप देश के जाने माने शास्त्री हैं विश्व के अर्थशास्त्री हैं पॉलिसी मेकर्स हैं देश को बहुत करीब से जाना समझा है तो एक नेशनलिस्ट भी हैं आप तो इसके नाते मेरा सवाल ये है जो डॉलर हंस रहा है पौंड ठहाका लगा रहा है तो हमारा रुपया मुस्कुराएगा कब ये पिछले 4 महीने से जो उसकी हालत है उस मुस्कुराहट कब वापस लौटेगी ये आपसे एक अर्ज है कुछ इस पर प्रकाश डालेंगे तो कृपा होगी धन्यवाद
So we closing the G20 discussion?
One more, I think. There's one more.
Okay, let's.
We'll come back to you then.
Yes, ma'am. Yeah. There's been no gender balance in this press conference so far. So why don't you ask your question?
Just a minute. She's bringing the mic.
So on taxation, I understand that Mr. Chidambaram, after the meeting for finance ministers, had said that it should be enriched, quote unquote, to take into account the concerns of developing countries. This is on transfer pricing and, avoid legal taxation. So, I mean, is there going to be anything further from India's point of view in terms of a suggestion on what needs to be done? Because this has been a big issue of late here.
That's a very important point, actually. I mean, the OECD and the G20 together had initiated some work in what they call base erosion and profit shifting. I mean, look, it's a phenomenon of the modern world that you have highly global enterprises operating in multiple countries. So when they're operating in multiple countries and they're buying, I mean, if they're all subsidiaries of the same company, when they're buying a product from one country for the main parent company, the issue is the profit that's being generated from the activity in the first country actually being made available to tax, or is it all being shifted to the other country through basically transfer pricing? I think this is a very important area. Most countries worry about this. I think developing countries worry about it especially because there is a perception, and quite logical, that, with globalization, multinational companies based in the industrialized world, it makes sense for them to shift a lot of their production to developing countries which are more competitive. Now, we actually welcome this, and other developing countries do, so we want them to locate their units in India. But you also want to be able to make sure that there's a reasonable profit taxation. So the OECD has done some work, and they will be making a presentation to the summit on the conclusions of their work on base erosion and profit shifting. There's also the issue of tax information transparency. That is, countries get a lot of information about people and transactions. Are they willing to share that? Our position on this has always been that tax jurisdictions should cooperate with each other in a symmetric way, in the sense that, we're willing to give them what they think is legitimate information, and they should give us what we think is legitimate information just for processing the determination of tax liability. So what is going to happen is that these initiatives are there. The OECD will put them forward, and the leaders will consider that and sort of give their views, indicate the extent to which they support. We are fully involved in this. I mean, in the sense that, I don't know what Mr. Chidambaram said to you, but the Ministry of Finance is actually involved in the process by which these reports are being prepared. I think at various stages, Mr. Chidambaram has said that, look, being involved is not enough. You've also got to take account of our concerns, that it should be a two-way process. I think it is reasonably a two-way process. I have to read what they're going to present. It's not as if the summit is going to sort of put a seal of approval on specifics. This is more like a more broad kind of framework. And what it does is, if there is a set of principles that are agreed, then each country can devise its own taxation rules to take advantage of those principles. And when people complain about it, each country can say, well, look, we're only doing what best practice is as defined by this OECD G20 effort.
Okay, last question on G20, and then he'll answer a few other questions. Yeah, Ranjit?
My question is on Syria again. So if the situation in Syria explodes, don't you think it will have serious consequences for economies like India and other developing countries? And don't you think you should raise this issue with your G20 partners and advise them not to take certain military steps which will destabilize West Asia?
I mean, you're asking two hypothetical questions. One is a hypothetical question about something that may happen. And then is a hypothetical question of, since it's not on the agenda, in what manner will be put on the agenda. Obviously, I cannot. I'm hoping that we won't have any disruptive event. And obviously, it's a politically very important issue. And for me to comment on it, sort of saying, if it happens, this is what we'll do, would not be proper. I have no basis. No, Prime Minister is free, but it's not appropriate for me to comment. So I'm not going to go beyond what the Prime Minister said.
So we'll go back to that question on Rupee.
Yeah, okay, the question about the Rupee. Right, now that the G20 has been taken care of, we get back to more exciting things. Look, I don't have very much to add to what has already been said by the Finance Minister and the Prime Minister. We have had a lot of volatility in the currency in India. The rupee has depreciated quite a bit. Very often in the Indian press, the impression given is that the whole world is stable, but the rupee has depreciated. This is not the case. The truth of the matter is there's a lot of currency volatility, and there's been depreciation in the Brazilian real, in the Indonesian rupiah, in the South African rand, and all kinds of currencies. It is true that the rupee has actually depreciated more than the others. And I think we've explained that because India had a somewhat high current account deficit. And this is not something that we were, by the way, ignoring. If you look at the 12th plan, which is now, has been available on our website for quite some time, but even the hard copies are now available, we said quite categorically that in the first year of the 12th plan, the current account deficit was too high, something like 4% or so, and it should be brought down gradually. So we knew it was a problem. Now it turned out that in the first year, we were writing when only half the year's information was available. It turned out that in the first year, it was worse than we thought, in the sense that it ended up by being 4.7% of GDP, not just about 4. And a very important reason for that was a huge increase in gold imports, which reflects all kinds of other factors I don't want to go into. But the government has quite categorically recognized that we cannot be continuing with such a large current account deficit. And I think the finance minister in Parliament the other day sort of said that, look, last year, that's 2012-13, we had a current account deficit of $88 billion. We are planning to bring it down to $70 billion. So the first point that I want to make is that it is true that the current account deficit was high, and what triggered the problem was, although it was high last year, $88 billion, we actually were able to finance it with $90 billion of inflow. So reserves actually went up slightly. So it didn't look as if it's a big problem, although we knew that it had to be brought down. Now the change is that when the chairman of the Federal Reserve made this statement about reversing the QE3, that obviously shook markets around the world and affected India also. And money that was earlier coming in quite freely started stopping and to some extent even going back. Now that obviously creates a serious financial problem, and we have to address that problem. And that problem we are addressing by making sure that the current account deficit for the year as a whole is actually going to be significantly lower. I want to emphasize to you one thing, and that is that you will not see that in the first quarter results for 2013-14 for the balance of payments. And the reason for that is that it is in April, May that you had a big increase in gold imports. Since then, gold imports have come down quite sharply. So the finance minister's prediction was that the current account deficit in the current year, 2013-14, will be approximately 3.7% of GDP. It'll be much higher than that in the first quarter. I don't know what it will be, but I don't want you, when it comes out, probably at the end of September, I don't want you to say, you said 3.7, look, it's much higher in the first quarter. I'm telling you now that it's not an official statement, it's my expectation. You will not see an improvement in the current account deficit until the second quarter results are available. Okay? But the finance minister is aware of all this. So when he said 3.7, he's talking about the year as a whole. I think that's possible. I think that's possible because gold imports will be sharply curtailed. We have, in fact, already, because of the depreciation and the impact on imports, there is an improvement that is evident in the trade account. So I expect that we will actually be able to reduce the current account deficit. Now, the other, when you're trying to reduce the current account deficit, I mean, any country, if you do a economics 101 exam, and you say there's a country called whatever it is, and it has a big current account deficit, what should it do? Well, most people will say it should contain aggregate demand and it should allow the exchange rate to change. So the first point is we have in fact seen quite a substantial change in the exchange rate. And that change is consistent with trying to reduce the current account deficit. So a lot of people who keep saying, no, why do you let the rupee depreciate? I mean, the honest truth is that depreciation hurts some people, but it helps a lot of other people. And this is a very important point. I mean, I know that a lot of people think depreciation is some question of national pride. But actually, if you want to have sensible macroeconomic management and you want to bring down the current account deficit, basically you have to allow the exchange rate to change. Okay? And what is doing is putting our exporters in a very strong position, because exporters now have a much more favorable position, just about at a point when we think the global economy may be turning around. So that's good. Also, the depreciation is going to make imports more expensive. And all the Indian producers who for a long time have been complaining that it's very difficult to compete against imports and imports are flooding in and imports are cheap, well, they will find it a lot easier to compete against imports because imports have become more expensive. As far as aggregate demand is concerned, the finance minister categorically said that he is going to maintain the fiscal deficit target, 4.8% of GDP. We have in fact communicated that target to the global community. I think the G-20 know about it also. So I think what the finance minister has said is that that's a red line. So I think it is true that the exchange rate has depreciated. It is not true that it's only happened in India. You could say that part of it is due to the high current account deficit, but actually it's due to the high current account deficit combined with a change in the financing capability. And we've reacted to that by planning to reduce the deficit, and at the same time doing a lot of things that will stimulate inflows. And just in case any of you interview me after the first quarter numbers come out, please remember that you will not see that improvement in the April-June current account deficit. Particularly the ones on television who like zero in on that. What?
Next.
Sorry, I can't hear what you're saying.
So do we expect the control situation, whatever you are telling us, by April 2014?
Sorry,
by 2014, next year.
Next year. No, I couldn't. I'm sorry. The sound is.
मैं हिंदी में बोल देता हूँ.
हाँ, बोलिए.
मैं ये कह रहा था, ये जो स्थिति है ये नियंत्रित होगी अप्रैल 2014 के पहले या फिर आगे जाएगा ये स्थिति?
नहीं, देखिए इसमें प्रिडिक्शन कोई नहीं कर सकता क्योंकि इट डिपेंड्स अगर वर्ल्ड कंडीशन क्या है, ऑयल प्राइसेस क्या हैं. मैं खाली ये कह रहा हूं कि आज की स्थिति अगर आप देखें तो मेरी ओपिनियन ये है कि कुछ तो डिप्रिसिएशन जारी थी, हो गई है. रुपी थोड़ा मुझे लगता है कि ओवर डिप्रिशिएट कर गया है, वो भी नॉर्मल है क्योंकि हम लोग यहाँ फिक्स नहीं कर रहे हैं कि ये है. इसकी आइडिया ये है कि इसको थोड़ा मार्केट को फ्लेक्सिबिलिटी देनी चाहिए और अगर थोड़ा ओवर हो गया तो कम भी हो जाएगा. So that is the way to handle or look at it. Okay?
Last two questions, Sanjay.
Can I ask both?
No. Good try.
So there seems to be a sort of veiled suggestion from your government that the responsibility for this current crisis lies with the economic policies of Pranab Mukherjee. Now this has also made the papers today. Very straight, sir. Does the UPA government believe that Pranab Mukherjee's economic policies over 3 years when he was finance minister is responsible for the state of the economy today? Can you allow?
You obviously read. We may be reading different papers, but I don't recall the particular news item. But I don't respond to newspaper stories either. I'm not aware. Look, I think to attribute anything to any one factor is not, I think, correct. I don't believe that anyone has said that. Possibly people are interpreting different things in different ways. So I think that a lot of the problems, after all, our view is that the present problem is in large part due to a change in global financing conditions, and that certainly cannot be attributed to whatever happened last year. I mean, the global financing conditions changed dramatically only earlier this year. Please remember that in the year 2012, 2013, okay, of which the first half was under the previous finance minister, in that period, the inflows that came in to finance the current account deficit were $90 billion. So I don't think that's certainly not the, I'm not aware that that's the government position. But if you're putting it in different people's mouths, you should ask them.
Last question.
सर मेरा सवाल ये है कि इस वक्त देश में डॉलर की जरूरत है, ज्यादा से ज्यादा निवेश आए, इस बात पे गौर करना चाहिए जिससे अर्थव्यवस्था दुरुस्त हो. लेकिन भारत में बिजनेस स्टार्ट करने के लिए जो वर्ल्ड बैंक की रिपोर्ट कहती है भारत 173rd पोजीशन पे है. तो यहाँ पे क्या दुरुस्त किया जाए जिससे अर्थव्यवस्था पटरी पर आए और ज्यादा से ज्यादा निवेश इस देश में आ सके?
देखिए, ये आप जो कह रहे हैं कि जो वर्ल्ड की ईज ऑफ डूइंग बिजनेस रिपोर्ट, फर्स्ट ऑफ ऑल ये 2009 की रिपोर्ट है. ओके, तो 2009 की रिपोर्ट बेस्ड ऑन डेटा ऑफ 2008 और 2007. तो ये जो आप कह रहे हैं ये सही है, लेकिन ये तब भी सही था जब इकोनॉमी 8-9% बढ़ रही थी. अब इकोनॉमी कम ग्रो कर रही है, हमें देखना चाहिए क्यों. लेकिन ये पॉइंट जो आप रेज कर रहे हैं करेक्ट है. इंडिया में ईज ऑफ डूइंग बिजनेस इतनी अच्छी नहीं है जितनी होनी चाहिए, और इसको हमने करेक्ट करना चाहिए. ये तो हमने अपने 12th प्लान में भी कहा हुआ है और एक्चुअली इसी रिपोर्ट को कोट किया हुआ है वहां. और हमें इसको अगर सुधारना है तो दो चीजें करनी पड़ेंगी. एक तो जो ये ईज ऑफ डूइंग बिजनेस की इंडेक्स है, ये कुछ 9-10 इंडिकेटर्स से बनी हुई है. उसमें आधे तो सेंट्रल गवर्नमेंट के हैं और आधे स्टेट गवर्नमेंट के हैं. तो सेंट्रल गवर्नमेंट जो स्टेट गवर्नमेंट के एरियाज हैं उसमें सेंट्रल गवर्नमेंट कुछ नहीं कर सकती, लेकिन जो सेंट्रल गवर्नमेंट के एरियाज हैं वहां पे हमें जरूर करना चाहिए. And we should do that, and there's no doubt in my view that we should do that.
Thank you very much. With that, we come to the end of this event.
Good.
Thank you very much.
Okay. As they say, saved by the bell.